Welcome to Blockstream Talk. Today's conversation is with Matthew Haywood, product manager for Blockstream's asset management platform. The Liquid network was originally conceived of as a faster, cheaper, more confidential way to move Bitcoin around. Over the last couple of years, though, it's evolved to allow a lot more flexibility, including the ability to issue and manage a variety of different assets. That includes transfer restricted assets, which can be used to facilitate security token issuances. I think this is a massive multi-trillion-dollar application. And for platforms like Bitfinex Securities or for issuers, it strikes a really good balance between KYC, AML, regulatory obligations, and ease or freedom of use for investors, which I think should probably be the primary focus of the security token industry. We also touched on some really fundamental considerations in the security token space, like what is tokenization? I think there's probably an important distinction to be made between digital securities and what I would consider to be security tokens. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Matt, thanks for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Do you want to start off with a quick introduction with a bit of background, who you are and what you do at Blockstream?
Yeah, sure. I'm Matthew Haywood. I'm the Blockstream AMP product manager. AMP is the asset management platform that allows you to issue assets that can be security tokens, tracked assets, and things like that on the Liquid network. And I've been with Blockstream since 2017 now.
What was your path to Bitcoin? How did you get into Bitcoin?
I was a gold bug before that, actually. So I'd had various obsessions over the years, and the last one before Bitcoin was about the global financial system, and I ended up coming out of that with a bit of a gold bug. And then I think this is in late 2014, and then I heard about Bitcoin. I think it's through Max Kaiser, who was also a bit of a fan of gold at the time and impending financial crisis and things like that. So I started reading up on more about the global financial system. Then when I heard about Bitcoin, I started reading that, and I had a little bit of background to the scarcity and why that was important and the lack of government interfering in the monetary policy. And then my developer side, because I've been a developer I'll show my age now. I've been a developer for like 20 something odd years now. But the technical side of it also interested me, like how did the nodes communicate? And then, from there it was down the rabbit hole and bought my first Bitcoin 2015. So I was a little bit cautious. I'm quite risk adverse, I'd say. So I did a lot of investigation into it first before I bought these magic internet tokens. But it really picked up. My interest in it really picked up around 2017 with the user accepted soft fork and that kind of thing. I started writing articles about how each of the different things in place would activate SegWit, like what SegWit 2x was trying to do, what the user activated soft fork was trying to do. I started writing those things on Medium. And then at the time I'd quit my software development job it was my own software development company that myself and two other people ran. Been doing that for several years, but my obsession with Bitcoin was taking over not just my free time, but my work time as well. So I jumped in. I worked with Adam Fixer on the precursor to the precursor to Wasabi Wallet, which was called a hidden wallet, and the framework was ZeroLink. So I worked with Adam for a while there. But then Blockstream asked if I wanted to do some technical writing, having read what I'd done on Medium, and I jumped at the opportunity to do that. And I've been doing various different roles at Blockstream since then.
Oh, that's very cool. I've always noticed that too, that the gold bugs are the easiest to convert. Whenever in the past I met someone who was a gold bug, and you give them the pitch on Bitcoin, and they'll ask you, they've got a couple of questions, and they ask a couple of questions, and if you can answer those, then it's off to the Bitcoin ATM.
Yeah.
I came to Bitcoin much the same way after the GFC, so that's quite interesting. So on to Liquid. So Liquid is a layer 2 solution for Bitcoin, right? Kind of like Lightning, but where the focus on Lightning is for retail payments, micropayments, that sort of thing. Liquid is more focused on financial markets, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Originally, when Liquid was launched as a sidechain, I think the focus was on speeding up payments for Bitcoin, primarily so that traders could take opportunity for arbitrage between exchanges. But um, that then got superseded more recently with focus on assets and financial markets, because Liquid has liquid Bitcoin as its default asset, which you can move around like any other asset on Liquid, and it's also used to pay the fees. But asset issuance is perhaps the thing that's perhaps more interesting. Allows you to issue assets. Anybody who runs a Liquid node, any member of the public, can issue their own asset and transfer them around. And then AMP, which I'm the product manager of, I'm sure we'll talk about later, that enables you to apply some restrictions to those assets. And nobody likes the word restrictions in the Bitcoin space anyway, but in order to meet regulations and, to comply with the law and what have you, these things have to be done. So it opens up to, financial markets, as you said.
Yeah, so I guess that was the original pitch, right? Is that Liquid was for faster, cheaper, more confidential Bitcoin transactions. And I think probably even a lot of people don't know that there's other assets that are included with that. That you could do the same. Those same benefits can be applied to something like Tether, right? Like tokenized US dollar.
Yeah.
And then AMP is just kind of the natural evolution of that, right? Building that out.
Yeah, AMP is actually it's an application layer on top of Liquid. So it's an API, and it uses the Blockstream Green backend, which has a two of two multi-sig system. So it uses that two of two system to restrict transfers between investors. So the asset issuer can determine who's whitelisted based on their wallet ID, who's allowed to accept it. And then, say I was sending some to you and you weren't whitelisted, I'd sign it with my wallet. It would ping over to the Green server, which would know that it was an AMP asset. It would ask AMP, is this destination wallet whitelisted? And if not, Green just doesn't add its second signature. So the transaction's invalid. There's no way I can force that transaction through. So AMP's an application layer that sits on top of Liquid and uses the Green infrastructure to allow issuers to issue security tokens and the like. They didn't have to be whitelisted assets. You can issue tracked assets as well. So if you're just interested in knowing which wallet, you don't even have to know who owns a wallet, just which wallet owns what asset at a particular point in time. You could pay out dividends or rewards or things like that. Probably just pay out rewards and not dividends, otherwise that sounds like it would be security. Yeah, so there's two main use cases for Blockstream AMP.
Okay, going back to Liquid again. So what is the federation?
Okay, so the federation, the federation, there's functionaries, and then within the functionaries there's block signers and watchmen. So I'll explain. There's the federation, basically the people who run the Liquid network in terms of block signing and the peg in and out, as it were. So Bitcoin enters through the peg in mechanism, it leaves through the peg out mechanism. So that's controlled by functionaries called watchmen. And so they ensure that the peg is one to one and that Bitcoin is created when Bitcoin is pegged in, and it's destroyed and passed on the Bitcoin side when it comes out. And then you have the block signer. So the federated signing model, which I think is what you're asking about, is instead of proof of work, Liquid uses this federated block signing model. So we have 15 functionaries that do the block signing that are spread out geographically and jurisdictionally around the globe. And what they do is they take part in a sort of round robin style block signings. So one of them will propose a block, and the others will validate the transactions in there. Once it meets a certain threshold of sort of pre-authorization, it then gets passed around between them for signatures. And you need 2/3 plus one. So out of 15 functionaries, you'd need 11 signatures on the block to make it valid. So that's how the blocks are created. And because it's this fixed signer model and not an open signer model, a dynamic signer model like a Bitcoin, you've got you can have definite block times. So one of the benefits of Liquid is that you get 1 minute block times. As well as confidential transactions and all these other features. It's the 1 minute block times which help place a lot more certainty on when developers are developing things for Liquid. You can be a lot more certain about when things are going to execute, which is a lot better for things like smart contracts and options and things like that. So it's that distributed model. So compared to going back to the original concept of using Liquid to do arbitrage, you'd have to have Bitcoin on one exchange, Bitcoin on another, maybe on 2 or 3 exchanges. You'd have to have your full amount of Bitcoin spread out to take full opportunity of that, which is highly risky. You're trusting three entities there with your Bitcoin. With Liquid, it's spread out. You'd have to have 11 out of 15 of them go rogue, as it were, to steal your Bitcoin, or to collude and do something, or for them all to be hacked. So it's not as trustless as Bitcoin, or as trust minimized as Bitcoin, but it's a lot better than trusting an exchange with your Bitcoin, for example. So it's this federated model that spreads, and it's not completely distributed, and I don't think we've claimed that it is, but it allows this consistent block time and these additional features to be enabled within the Liquid sidechain.
Bit of a trade-off, really, right?
With Lightning and Liquid, which I don't think people like to pit them against each other, Lightning versus Liquid, but I think that they both suit different use cases. I'm a regular Lightning user. I use the Breeze wallet on a weekly basis for small payments, because they do things like manage the channel. So I think with Liquid and Lightning, you take Bitcoin, and then if you turn up the speed of block dial, as it were, you end up with faster block times or faster confirmations, perhaps. But that's a trade-off for having to be online all the time, with Lightning, or with Liquid to having to have this functionary model. So you can I like to think that you can take Bitcoin, turn up certain features, but that means that other ones have to be turned down correspondingly. And Liquid and Lightning just do turn different things up to different levels, I guess. Liquid, it's a push thing, a bit like Bitcoin. You can have an address and I can just pay you without you having to be online and things like that. And there's no channels to manage, and you can issue assets on it. It's got confidential transactions, whereas Lightning's even quicker, and it's good for micropayments or streaming payments and things like that. And you are more in control of entry and exit into Lightning.
What about governance within the federation?
The governance is interesting, because there's a governance board for Liquid. So Blockstream are more like the technical service providers, as it were. It's the board who are supposed to define where Liquid goes, what new members get added to the federation, things like that. And Blockstream are the sort of technical advisors, as it were. Now, this didn't start off like that. The initial launch, but it's more and more like that nowadays. So they have a federate board membership meeting where they discuss who's moving in or out of this functionary group and things like that, and new features which they like. Obviously, Blockstream will add new features when they think of new features, like covenants, or to enable options and things like that. Or we've published some work to show how you can do swaps on Liquid, which is very popular, actually. The idea of doing asset swaps. But it's the federation who are ultimately in charge. They're the ones who run the signers, the block signers, and they're in charge of the entry and exit, peg in, peg out to Liquid. And we've done something called DynaFed recently. And so DynaFed is short for Dynamic Federation. So the idea there is that rather than us saying, okay, we're adding a new member in and you can all approve it, but then we have to provide you with the updated entries into the list of who's able to sign blocks or peg in or peg out, that this can be a dynamic thing that they can vote, as it were, within the blockchain to add new functionaries into the list. So let's say that somebody decided they were going to get added, they wanted to be added to the list. They'd have to make a proposal, and the rest of the federation would have to come to a agreement on that. And then they would dynamically get added to that list over time. So DynaFed is interesting because it's a big push to say that this is your network, you're in charge, you decide who's a member of it.
Got it. And so I think we've seen quite an acceleration with L-BTC peg-ins over the last couple of years. What do you think's been driving that?
I think it's perhaps more. I mean, there's a bit of a chicken egg problem, as there is for many of these new things, newish things. In that we want people to issue assets and develop things on top of Liquid, but you'd be less likely to do that unless there was users, and the users wouldn't come unless there was the application. So I think that we've seen a lot of developers kickstarting that who have been drawn in because they want to be able to do swaps. So where I pay you L-BTC and I get back B&M, which is one of our assets, and that exchange gets completed in one transaction. It's final in one transaction. There's no counterparty risk. So swaps is very popular, actually. There's quite a few platforms that are building on Liquid to do swaps. So I think that developers have been drawn in by some of the technology, confidential transactions, the ability to do these asset swaps or issue assets and things. So I think that's like a playground for developers who have then created apps, and then that means that people have started to come in. And Liquid Bitcoin, L-BTC, is the default asset. So if you want to transact these assets, other assets, or indeed if you just want to send L-BTC to somewhere else, you have to pay the fee in L-BTC. So I think that's probably part of the reason why I hope the amount of Bitcoin pegged into Liquid has increased, and certainly the amount of assets that have been issued are increasing as well. And they could be all kinds of things. Security tokens, like our own Blockstream mining note would be another good example. And there's NFTs. I'm not sure how popular they are, but the people have been issuing a lot of those in-game tokens. There's quite a number of things.
Not so popular anymore.
Yeah. Perhaps not. I don't know what crazy prices. But NFTs, a non-fungible token, is perfectly, if there's one of this one thing, it's perfectly good as an in-game thing. Like I know my son's a big gamer, and the amount of money people pay for like a skin in some of these games or what have you, like a slightly different color gun or something like that, bonkers. But if there are games like Pixelmatics games that do these in-game tokens, and they, if you issue one of them, there's only one out there, and that's the tradable token. So that makes a bit more sense to me than pictures of ape.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me as well. I agree on that.
Each their own.
Rocks.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that L-BTC is the default asset for Liquid. Is it correct to call that the native token, or is it Bitcoin?
Yes, L-BTC. I think so. This is interesting because if people have said, you could talk about Lightning and say, is it Lightning Bitcoin or is it Bitcoin? And people will argue, well, it's Bitcoin. So if you peg into Liquid, it's called Liquid Bitcoin. The ticker is L-BTC. Could you say it's Bitcoin? I'm sure people would come with very good arguments to say that it is. It's pegged one-to-one. It has slightly different properties. It can travel through the Liquid network differently, but then so can Bitcoin when it's on Lightning. So yeah, Bitcoin is the native asset, and it's what the fees are paid in. So you can send it around rapidly. It's like you take Bitcoin, put it into Liquid, and it gets all these extra features of confidential transactions, 1-minute block times, and all this. And it's also what you use to pay the fees if you're transacting on Liquid, regardless of what asset you send. But any other assets are sent in the same way. It's just that Bitcoin is the only one that's pegged in and out. The others just live in Liquid, as it were.
Yeah, in terms of like drivers for L-BTC as well, I think another big one could be USDT. I think whenever the market gets hot, it's always looking for different ways to do USDT transactions that are cheap, right? That's how Tron got big, is because Ethereum got clogged up and got expensive. So I think I've always thought that going forward that could be another big driver for Liquid, and to see more peg-ins, because people will want to do more transactions, USDT transactions, on Liquid, just because it's so much cheaper than everything else.
Yeah, it is. It is cheap because the rapid block time. I mean, the transactions are a bit large. Well, they are quite a bit larger than transactions on Bitcoin, because all the extra stuff has to go into confidential transactions. But the blocks are regular enough and of a size that the fees are low on Liquid, and you've got this regular block time. And yeah, USDT is very interesting because that closed the original loop that we mentioned earlier with the arbitrage side of things. But also, it's interesting because it enables swaps of. So our Blockstream mining node BMN, which is a claim on or reward paid for a certain amount of hash rate in our mining operation. Yeah, that if you were pricing that in Bitcoin, it would perhaps be a bit. I mean, you could do a swap L-BTC for BNM, but yeah, to be able to swap it for USDT back and forward gives a bit more of a, I don't know, better price history. It's easy to work out the price history as it were when it's just priced in the dollar, but the USDT transfers between. I mean, it's easy to use. You can install a Liquid wallet. There are quite a few of them now. Liquid uh, uh, Blockstream Green, of course, being probably the most common. But it's easy to use to pay my son his what you might call allowance. We'd call it pocket money each week. It was on. I used to do it over the Bitcoin network. That got a bit expensive going back to the days when the fees were quite high. So we switched to using Liquid then. But I now pay him on Lightning as well because there are more things he can spend his Lightning Bitcoin on. Whereas I think Liquid is perhaps a bit more focused on the investor type or the financial markets or people who are trade. My son's not going to be trading BNM. He might be. He might be keeping it quiet for me.
That's right. I saw, yeah, somebody in BM in the Telegram chat pinging it around. Maybe that was him doing OTC trades.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah.
It's just different use cases, isn't it? I mean, like Lightning isn't appropriate for doing a $2 million USDT transaction, right? You're not going to do that to move it back and forth between your trading accounts. So it's just a very different use case.
Back in the days when it was hashtag reckless, I used as it was then Lightning Core to send around to buy things actually from the Blockstream store. And that was all. You have to open channels, manage channels, and I thought, I'm sure somebody's going to make this easier in time. But at the time, it was pretty hard to get into. But of course, he abstracted that away. A wallet like the one I mentioned, Breeze, plenty of others, I'm sure. It's a non-custodial wallet that abstracts that away, and we're trying to help developers who are developing on Liquid. One of the big pushes that we're doing at the moment is to improve our documentation to make it easier for developers to get into. I think that we have been too focused in the past on here's some cool technical thing that you can do with Liquid, with the cryptographic, whatever, this, that, and the other, and here's 5,000 lines of code and off you go. It doesn't quite work like that with some of the developers we've spoken to. They want JavaScript libraries, they want high level libraries that they can use, plug into a website and use straight away. So we've been focused a lot recently. One of the things that I'm involved with is improving the documentation that we've got and getting those developers and building up more of a developer community around Liquid, because there's a lot of interest in the technology and what potential they could do with things like options and smart contracting and things like that on Liquid. We've just got to help them make it easier. But there's also a lot of third parties who have released a lot of great libraries in JavaScript and things like that we haven't. So it's nice that we've started doing these interviews with developers who've been developing things on Liquid to find out what they've been using. And a lot of the things that we thought we'd have to create, they're already out there. The people have done, which is brilliant. It's a great thing to find out that people are already developing things that we thought that we needed to do. Yeah, it's good. And Elements itself, which is the open source software that Liquid's built on, people are also looking at developing their own sidechain using Elements and things like that. With a different federation, and maybe they'll tweak some of the properties in it, and then hopefully the work that they do, they might, if they come up with new features or new technologies, they can add back into Elements, and they may well be picked up in Liquid. Who knows? But it's just good to get more developers interested, because it creates exciting tools and cool things that people like to try out.
No, that's hugely important too, and I think a lot of handholding is also required because my experience with the BMN, when you reach out to custodians or people like that they may not have had experience with Liquid, and so the more help and they may not have resources of people who have worked on it previously. So the more help that you can provide in terms of documentation and handholding, I think that's super key to driving adoption.
Yeah, and I like the approach of copy paste amend to programming. So if you get like the elementsproject.org website, that's tutorial based. It's follow along, copy, run the code, and then you can take that and amend it. But we have feedback that that is the kind of thing that people want. They want to see, step through it, see how it works, and then understand how they can play around with it, rather than looking at the source code and trying to build up and figure out how these components fit together. So yeah, we'll be placing more of a focus on, here's some cool new technology, but rather than just dump a load of complicated stuff in some repository, thousands of lines of code, here's an example, here's a working model that you can take and amend, and use yourself, so that people can come along, go, that looks cool, and then get something up and running in a short amount of time.
Great. Let's talk about the asset management platform. What types of assets can you manage, and how can you manage them?
Yeah, so I mentioned that briefly earlier, but I'll go into a bit more detail. So, as I said, it's an application that runs on top of Liquid. So all the transactions of those assets are done on the Liquid network, and they're all covered by confidential transactions. The issuance is done on Liquid as well. The AMP asset management platform is an API. You would call the API, a few lines of code, call the API, and it would issue an asset. It would create a transaction basically that issues an asset straight into your wallet if you were the issuer. You can then distribute that out to investors, and they can exchange it between each other. But you have more control because of this 2 of 2 multisig that I mentioned before. So one of the restrictions is that the investors, it doesn't have to be investors, it could just be people who hold the asset, have to have a green wallet because of this 2 of 2 system. So the tracked asset is where you don't need to register the investors, but the transfer restricted type, which is something that gets used for STOs, security tokens and the like, that does require whitelisting first. So I'll try to explain how that works. So essentially, AMP contains a list of wallet IDs, so green wallet IDs of wallets that are allowed to receive that asset. So the issuer would go through a process of KYC about their investors, make sure where they're residing and what jurisdictions they're under and what have you. And if they fulfill the criteria, then they would ask them for their green wallet ID, or their AMP ID from the green wallet, I should say, and they then add that to AMP. That person is now allowed to receive that particular asset. But the investor, the benefits for the investor is that once they have that in their wallet, once it's been distributed to them, they can send it to any other investor without having to request permission from the asset issuer. Swaps, as I said, are really good for this. So to do a swap in one transaction, you can send me USDT, I can send you something like BNM, and that can finalize in one transaction, which removes counterparty risk. It means that you can have markets where people propose swaps, and other, they're the makers, and other people are the takers of those and complete the swaps. So it just takes the trading and ownership of those kind of tokens, securities, and tokenizes them in a way that enables people to trade them peer to peer, as long as they're in this whitelist, because there are still rules that apply to these such things, obviously. And the other benefit for the issuer is not just so they can be sure that it's not being sent where it shouldn't be sent and they're going to get in trouble, but they can also view the transaction graph for that asset. So when the transaction comes off to green and it thinks, oh, this is an AMP asset, and it lets AMP know about it to do its check, AMP will then store the plain text of the transaction. So everybody publicly will see confidential transactions on the Liquid blockchain for those, and they won't know what asset was traded. They won't know how much of it was traded, because confidential transactions covers the asset type and the amount. But the issuer will be able to get a view of their asset, who owns it and when. And that's particularly useful for things like dividends. They may say at this particular date in time, they'll ask AMP for, tell me which wallets owned my asset at this particular point in time, and I'm now going to pay out a dividend. And they could pay out USDT over Liquid by querying AMP and saying, get me a new address for each of these wallets, and it goes off on our screen for a new address for each of the wallets of people who hold the asset, and they can actually pay out USDT. So this sort of, I think that's really cool. The automated, dividend or reward payouts, and you as the investor will, you own some asset XYZ on your phone, and then on dividend payout day, you suddenly get paid in USDT or Bitcoin or whatever it is that they're paying out in. So that's cool. And and the peer-to-peer side is most interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, as someone who works at an STO exchange, I think that that's really interesting as well, right? That it strikes a really good balance between ease of use and then maintaining all the KYC, AML regulatory obligations that we have, so that you can allow users to trade it on the platform. They can pull it off the platform, self custody if they wish, zip it over to another platform for arbitrage, or trade peer to peer. I think that's pretty unique.
Yeah, without the issuer having to get involved at every step, or without some third party or intermediary having to, manage the transaction or anything like that. It's just done through rules held, within AMP, and the transaction is done over the liquid blockchain. Yeah.
I was going to say that for dividends also, I mean, it gets really interesting if you can start streaming dividends on a really granular basis, right? Like, instead of paying dividends annually or quarterly, what if we could do them monthly, weekly, daily, hourly? I mean, that's just like a whole new type of capital market. That's really exciting.
Yeah, that's really interesting use case. And things like, what are the example? Oh, vesting shares as well. So if you started with the company and you had an allocation of shares, and you vested a certain amount each month, you can actually be paid them out on that month. But like you said, well, or year, well, why is it done monthly or yearly? Could it be done less? Yeah. And I guess the most granular level was you could do it by the minute, if you particularly wanted to, for these payouts. But yeah, it's interesting that, I think, first of all, people look to replicate what's already being done. Let's pay out dividends yearly and things like that. And then people think, oh, we don't actually have to do it like that necessarily. That maybe a much better way to do it, and it may encourage more trading to occur as well. And if these things happen on a more frequent basis rather than a rush near the end, yeah.
What do you think tokenization means then in the context of securities? Because you look at some of these, platforms, and due to regulatory restrictions, you can't necessarily pull the assets off the platform. Some of these platforms that do tokenized equities, like tokenized Apple or Tesla or something, it looks a lot like, an eToro, where maybe you can do fractional trading, but you can't do self custody, you can't do peer to peer, you can't do, move it to other exchanges and do arbitrage. Is that so? What is the threshold for tokenization? I kind of feel like you need to be able to do those things to be able to call it tokenization.
Token gesture, tokenization, if you pardon the pun there. Yeah. What have they done? That they've digitized. It's probably digitized already. People aren't trading certificates around necessarily, but if you can't hold it, yourself, and you can't trade without having to use that platform, it's just pinging numbers around in the database, isn't it? And it just seems like, it might be paying lip service to something rather than actually, tokenizing, and providing that digital token to someone. And it's the peer-to-peer aspect that I think is the most interesting to me. You and I can, we could trade on these things at whatever price we agree between each other to settle whenever, and do that completely out of band. Nobody else, needs to be involved in that, or taking a cut, or whatever else that they may do. They may wish to take a cut, but it's that aspect of it that's most interesting to me. And the fact that you can custody it yourself. I mean, there are, safeguards in place that, especially within something like AMP, that if somebody loses access to their token, we need to be able to, the issue needs to make them whole again, but we can freeze the UTXOs, using, again, this 2 of 2 signature system. So, if I say I've lost my access to my wallet, the issuer can freeze that wallet, because they don't want me to find it again and end up with double the amount, in case I pretend that I've lost it. And reissue the amount of the token to make whole. And the fact that the issuances occur on the liquid blockchain and are publicly auditable as well. So anybody can run a liquid node, and you can look at the issuances of a particular asset. So if I'm buying, you mentioned shares earlier, if I'm buying shares, I can see how many have been issued. And so I know if I'm buying one of them, it's one of however many thousand or however many been issued, and that they haven't created any more, and that they're not fractionally reserved trading them or anything. I can see how many have been issued. And when I get one over the blockchain, I know that that one is one of however many. So that's a good guarantee as well. From the investor's point of view, in terms of assuredness that of what they're actually buying and holding. So that's of another interesting thing as well. The public verification of the supply, as it were.
Yeah, how easy is it for issuers to generate and manage assets? I know that there's a new asset issuer tool.
Yes. So, but I'll draw some. There's some distinctions to be made. To issue a regular liquid asset that can be traded by anybody, nobody can stop you from trading it. There's no restrictions on transfer. A normal liquid asset, you can download Elements, which is the open source platform Liquid's built on. By default, that will connect to Liquid. You can issue one command, issue asset, give it an amount and what have you, and you will have just issued an asset which you can then send around to anybody else on the Liquid blockchain. So that's the standard Liquid asset. Then you've got an asset which is issued on AMP, which has the ability to have restrictions applied to it. What I didn't mention, because it is a bit more complicated, is if I sent you either of those assets to your Liquid wallet, it would show up as a long hexadecimal string. That would be the identifier. It's not very snappy. If I send you BNM, easily recognizable, and there's also ways you can check that the asset is actually issued by Blockstream.com and what have you. There's like a proof of issuance page on our website, and asset issuers can prove that they issued a particular asset. The contract, the domain, the ticker, and what have you, is baked into the asset issuance. It's hashed actually in the issuance transaction. But normally, if you're going to issue an asset on Liquid and you wanted to have a domain and a ticker so that it showed up in wallets like that, you have to go through a process of registering the asset with the Blockstream Asset Registry, which is on GitHub. It's open source, and you add your it's publicly viewable, and you add your asset on there, and then you put a proof file on your domain, and the registry checks that the proof file is who you said you are, and then blah blah blah. And it's a bit of a complicated process. And the scripts that we share, this is what I was mentioned earlier about how we perhaps have been a bit too low level on things. It's like, yeah, you can do that. Here's this 100-line long script you have to run, which wasn't particularly popular. Some developers, fine, not got a problem with that. But for the standard user who wants to, I want to issue an asset, and I want to call it this, and I want to do that, we've got something called the Asset Management Tool, which is a website where you go, you fill in the name, the ticker, what precision you want. Like that means like how many decimal places should it go down to is the minimum amount you can send to anyone and things like that. You fill in all these details, and very much like the AMP example I gave earlier, that web server will issue the asset in a transaction broadcast on the Liquid network, and it appears in your wallet. So although it broadcasts a transaction, it's your asset. It appears within your wallet. It's created in that transaction within your wallet. So that greatly simplifies the whole process and of registering the asset and what have you. You fill the details in, you click go. You still have to put a file on your domain if you want to prove that it was, Jesse that issued the asset and not somebody who's pretending to be you. So there's still that step you can do as well. But it makes it a lot easier, and things like the icon submission, so it appears in wallets that recognize the icon, like green desktop or mobile. So that's the asset management tool as it stands now. And we want people to be able to issue assets and manage the life cycle of regular liquid assets through the tool. Now, at the moment, and without having to use Elements, which is like a full Liquid node, we want people to be able to issue assets to their green wallet and perform actions within their green wallet. Like I want to reissue, which means create more of the asset. I want to distribute it to investors from within a mobile or desktop app. So that's how asset management tool AMT will change over the coming months, is that we will start to integrate more of these features. So not just the issuance, but the management of the asset as well, creating more of it, burning, destroying the asset, distributing it to investors and things like that. So that will continue to evolve just to make it easy for regular users to actually manage the asset. The AMP side at the moment, AMP's an API. We've got lots of examples of how to use the API. It's fairly simple to use API, but that currently also requires that you run a Liquid node to do some of the functionality. So that in the future, further down the line, that will also be incorporated into the asset management tool more than likely. But people will still use the API because, but they'll have a choice then. I mean, at the moment, I think everybody that uses AMP has integrated the API. It's a fairly simple API to integrate, and it can integrate into common workflows. So Stocker.io, who manage the sale of the Blockstream BNM, they have integrated AMP. So, they already had a process whereby they collected investor registration information and allocated certain amounts of the assets they were selling. They just made extra calls to AMP along the way so that AMP was in line with what they were doing. So AMP will remain an API, but the asset management tool will hopefully make things easy for regular users who are happy to use a web interface and their mobile or desktop app to manage the asset. I think it will mean that more people issue assets and less people having to run things from black and white terminals.
If you're thinking about a mid-cap company, that's just like a $150 million market widget maker, and it's kind of a big ask to get, I think at the moment, to get their IT department to go out and issue and manage transfer restricted assets on Liquid.
Yeah.
Ideally, I think like we can do that, but Bitfinex Securities can do that, Stalker can do that, Digital and Merge can do that. But ideally, in a perfect world, it would be the issuer that could do all of that stuff themselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's always been the KYC side of things. You can't actually hold any KYC information within AMP. That's done outside, and a reference is held within AMP. So that's the kind of thing that Stocker have done for BNM, and yourselves do for your customers. So that side of it needs to be handled either by the issuer or by a third party or service provider that they use. So we actually make that available within AMP. If I'm the asset issuer, I can delegate the investor management side to a sub user, as it were. So they can also call the AMP API on my behalf, but just to manage the investor record side of things. So we're making that easier. Actually integrating the API, or like I said, small organizations it's not that hard to issue and reissue the asset. But it'd be a lot easier if we had a front end for these kind of things for those kind of organizations to be able to do it. Yeah, but a larger organization with quite a sizable development team shouldn't have any effort at all. Really, it's not that much code to implement. A lot of the complexity happens on our side. So
yeah, and I guess for the moment, that kind of stuff that's the niche that Stalker and Bitfinex Securities and Digital, that's part of the service that we can offer, is to help with that, the technical side of doing STO issuances.
yeah, absolutely.
What does the future hold for Liquid and the asset management platform, do you think?
Yeah, I think continued focus on assets, asset issuance of things like security tokens, and as important, what you can do with those. So swaps have been very popular feature. Completion of a transaction of an exchange, a trade in one transaction. But then we have things like options, and there's other smart contracts. Liquid's got these different. I can't speak too much about them. I can't claim to be an expert in them. But there's smart contracting capabilities of Liquid. But things like options, where you have options that to trade this for this amount that expires on this certain day, and all these kind of things. But we're aware at Blockstream that when we come up with these cool new things and we say, hey, look, you can do this, it has to be presented in a way where you can do this. Here's the code, here's the documentation, here's an example, and here's a working sample that you can take and amend yourself, so that developers can go, cool, that developers are really interested into being able to do these cool new things, but it's got to be easy for them to take it, amend it, make it their own, and to get to people to issue these kind of assets and to do these kind of contracts, and to bring that in, and then more users, more developers, more users. So it's the chicken egg problem I mentioned earlier. Is the round is kick-started with when developers come in because they're just interested in cool new features, And we've seen that with issuance and swaps, and with the new things coming up, like options I mentioned would open that up. And financial markets, well, they're ready to be innovated upon, I think. And it would be nice if it was if that was done on liquid.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. Long overdue, a bit of an upgrade. That's great, Matt. I appreciate your time today, and we should do this again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jesse. It's good talking to you, man.